It was my first Christmas alone since my parents had retired and moved down south. I'd always loved spending the holidays with them, but work commitments kept me tied to my home in a small New England town that year. Determined to make the best of it, I decided to stay cozy in my little rental cottage, surrounded by the snowy woods. I set up a small tree, lit some candles, and played classic Christmas music on the old radio my mom had left me. It wasn't the same as family Christmases, but it was peaceful. By Christmas Eve, a thick layer of snow blanketed the ground. The forecast promised even more snow overnight, so I resigned myself to a quiet evening indoors. I built a fire in the stone fireplace, poured myself a mug of hot cocoa, and curled up with a book. Outside, the snow fell steadily, its silence deepening the solitude. Around 10 p.m., just as I was about to head to bed, I heard a faint knock at the front door. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. Who would be out in this weather on Christmas Eve? I waited, holding my breath, but the knock came again, soft, hesitant, but unmistakable. I grabbed my phone and went to the door, hesitating before looking through the peephole. The porch light cast a dim glow on the snow-covered yard, but no one was there. My stomach tightened as I slowly opened the door, peeking out into the night. The porch was empty. I scanned the yard, but all I saw were the swirling snowflakes. Still, the feeling of being watched prickled at the back of my neck. I quickly closed the door, locking it tightly, and went back to the living room, trying to shake the unease. An hour later, as I lay in bed reading, I heard it again, this time, from the back of the house. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on the kitchen window. My pulse quickened as I grabbed my phone and crept toward the sound. The kitchen was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the Christmas tree in the living room. I reached the window and peered out, my breath fogging the glass. Nothing. I flipped on the outside light, but the yard was empty, the snow untouched. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe a branch brushing against the house. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went back to the living room, deciding to stay up and keep the fire going. As I added another log, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. They were faint but visible in the snow just beyond the porch. They led from the front of the house to the side window, my bedroom window. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but as I dialed, the fireplace went out. Not slowly, as a fire naturally would, but all at once, as if someone had snuffed it out. The room plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the flickering Christmas tree. I froze, my phone slipping from my hand as I heard the faintest sound behind me. Breathing. I spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. Or so I thought. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the far edge of the room, just beyond the glow of the tree lights. It was tall, shrouded in darkness, but its face, or lack of one, was what stopped my breath. A blank expanse, featureless and pale, like a mask carved from snow. I backed away, my legs trembling, and the figure tilted its head, as if curious. Then, in one fluid motion, it stepped forward, the light from the tree casting long, eerie shadows across the room. I stumbled into the kitchen, grabbing the first thing I could find, a knife. When I turned back, the figure was gone. I locked myself in the bathroom, shaking as I called the police. They arrived quickly, their flashing lights illuminating the snow-covered yard. The officers found no one, but they did find more footprints, leading from the porch to the back of the house, and then disappearing into the woods. They searched the area but came up empty-handed. One of the officers suggested it might have been a prank, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe that any more than I did. I stayed at a hotel for the rest of the holiday, too terrified to return to the house. When I went back to collect my things a few days later, I found something that still haunts me. On the mantel above the fireplace, where I'd hung a single stocking, was a small, hand-carved figure of a man. It was crudely made, its face featureless and pale, just like the figure I'd seen that night. I didn't touch it, I couldn't. I left the house that day and never went back. To this day, I don't know who, or what, was outside my house that Christmas Eve. But every year, as the holidays approach, I can't help but feel that same prickle of unease, as if I'm being watched. And I wonder if one day, I'll hear that soft, hesitant knock again. It was the winter of 2017, and my best friend Charlie invited me to spend Christmas with his family in their secluded cabin deep in the woods of Maine. I didn't have much going on that year, so I happily accepted. The cabin was a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pine trees. It was the kind of place where the silence felt almost alive, broken only by the occasional call of an owl or the crunch of snow underfoot. Charlie's family was welcoming, and the first few days were perfect. We spent our time sledding, drinking spiked cocoa, and playing board games by the roaring fireplace. The cabin's rustic charm and the surrounding snowy wilderness made it feel like something out of a holiday movie. But then, on Christmas Eve, things started to feel off. That evening, as the family gathered around the table for dinner, I noticed something strange through the large living room window. A faint light was flickering in the woods, far beyond the clearing. It was small and distant, but unmistakable, a cold, bluish glow that didn't seem natural. "Hey, Charlie," I said, pointing it out. "What's that?" He squinted, following my gaze. "Probably someone camping," he said with a shrug. "Some locals like to set up in the woods around this time of year." I nodded, though it didn't sit right with me. Who would camp out here in the freezing cold? And why would they use a light like that instead of a campfire? After dinner, I couldn't stop thinking about the light. As the family settled in to exchange stories by the fire, I slipped outside for some air. The snow crunched under my boots as I stepped into the clearing, the icy air biting at my skin. The light was still there, flickering faintly between the trees. I stood there for a moment, mesmerized, before deciding to take a closer look. I grabbed a flashlight from the porch and headed into the woods, telling myself it would only take a few minutes. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The wind seemed to fade, and even the sound of my footsteps felt muffled. The light grew brighter as I approached, but it didn't behave like a flashlight or lantern. It pulsed softly, almost like it was breathing. When I finally reached the source, I froze. The light was emanating from a small, circular object hanging from a low branch. It looked like a glass ornament, but it pulsed with a faint, unnatural glow. I reached out to touch it, but as my fingers grazed its surface, the light blinked out, leaving me in total darkness. Panic set in as I fumbled with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the dense trees. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like something moving through the snow. It came from all around me, growing louder and closer with each passing second. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I turned and ran, the flashlight bouncing wildly as I stumbled through the woods. The rustling followed me, persistent and deliberate. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the clearing that the sound stopped abruptly. I turned back, panting, but the woods were silent and still. When I got back to the cabin, Charlie was waiting on the porch. "Where were you?" he asked, his tone sharp. "I saw something," I said, breathless. "A light in the woods." He frowned. "You shouldn't have gone out there," he said quietly. "Why not?" I pressed. Charlie hesitated, glancing over his shoulder before lowering his voice. "There's a story around here, about the lights. They say they show up every Christmas, luring people into the woods. But no one who follows them ever comes back." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin and whistle of the wind set my nerves on edge. Around 2 a.m., I got up to get some water and noticed the living room window was open, the curtains fluttering in the breeze. I crossed the room to close it, but as I reached for the latch, I froze. The light was back. It was closer now, just beyond the clearing, its eerie blue glow casting faint shadows on the snow. And this time, it wasn't alone. Several smaller lights flickered in the darkness, bobbing and weaving like fireflies. I stepped back, my heart racing, and nearly tripped over Charlie, who had come downstairs. "You see them, don't you?" he said, his face pale. I nodded. "What do we do?" "We wait," he said grimly. "And whatever you do, don't go outside." The lights moved closer, circling the cabin like a pack of wolves stalking prey. At one point, they came so close that their glow illuminated the living room, casting strange, shifting patterns on the walls. I could hear faint whispers, too soft to make out but undeniably there. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights vanished. The room plunged into darkness, the silence almost deafening. Charlie and I stayed up the rest of the night, too afraid to sleep. By morning, the lights were gone, leaving no trace of their presence. We tried to explain it to the family over breakfast, but they didn't believe us. Probably just some kids playing with drones, Charlie's dad said with a chuckle. But Charlie and I knew better. Those weren't drones, and whatever had been out there wasn't playing. When we went outside later that day, we found something in the clearing, small, circular depressions in the snow, arranged in a perfect spiral. They weren't footprints, and they didn't lead anywhere. It was as if something had descended from the sky, left its mark, and disappeared. I left the cabin that afternoon, making an excuse about work. I couldn't stay there another night, not after what I'd seen. Charlie didn't argue, he seemed just as shaken as I was. To this day, I don't know what those lights were or what they wanted. But every Christmas, I think about that cabin in the woods and the strange, flickering glow that lured me into the darkness. And I wonder how many people have followed them, and never come back. It was December 24th, and I was spending Christmas Eve at my sister Beth's new house in the rural outskirts of Pennsylvania. It was a charming old farmhouse, surrounded by open fields and dense woods. Beth had moved there just a few months earlier with her husband, Mike, and their 2 kids. They were still settling in, but the place was already decked out for Christmas, garlands hung over the fireplace, stockings were carefully arranged, and a massive pine tree stood in the corner of the living room, its lights twinkling merrily. The day had been festive and noisy, filled with wrapping paper, gingerbread cookies, and the kids running around the house. By the time night fell, the kids were tucked into bed, and the adults were enjoying a quiet moment by the fire with mugs of mulled wine. Around 9 p.m., the doorbell rang. Beth and Mike exchanged confused looks. "Who would be visiting on Christmas Eve?" she asked, getting up to answer the door. I followed her, curious. When she opened the door, no one was there. Just the dark, snow-covered front yard stretching into the shadows of the woods beyond. But sitting on the porch was a small, wrapped gift. The paper was plain red with a white ribbon tied neatly around it. There was no tag, no note, nothing to indicate who had left it. "Maybe it's from one of the neighbors," Mike said, though his tone didn't sound convinced. Beth brought the gift inside and set it on the coffee table. We debated opening it but decided to wait until morning. It was odd, sure, but nothing to worry about. At least, that's what we told ourselves. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I lay awake in the guest room, unable to sleep. The house was old, and every creak and groan of the wood seemed amplified in the quiet. I was just starting to doze off when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Mike or Beth, but the steps didn't sound like they were coming from the hallway. They were heavier, echoing faintly, like they were coming from outside. I got up and peeked out the window. Standing at the edge of the yard, just beyond the reach of the porch light, was a figure. They were tall and motionless, their features obscured by the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. After a few moments, the figure turned and disappeared into the woods. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I told Beth and Mike what I'd seen, but they shrugged it off. "Probably just a deer or something," Mike said, though the look in his eyes suggested he wasn't so sure. The mysterious gift was still sitting on the coffee table, untouched. Beth finally decided to open it, her kids crowding around her with curiosity. Inside was a small, porcelain figurine of a woman. It was exquisitely detailed, dressed in a long gown with a tiny wreath in her hands. At first glance, it seemed harmless, but there was something unsettling about her expression. Her eyes were wide and glassy, her mouth set in a slight frown, almost as if she were worried. "Creepy," Beth muttered, setting it back in the box. "Probably some kind of antique." The kids didn't seem interested, and the figurine was quickly forgotten as the day's festivities took over. But I couldn't shake the strange feeling it gave me, like it was watching us. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I was lying in the guest room when I heard it again, the footsteps. This time, they were louder, more deliberate, moving across the porch. My heart pounded as I crept to the window and peeked outside. The figure was back, standing closer to the house now. The porch light illuminated them just enough for me to see their face, or rather, the lack of it. Their features were blurred, almost like a smudged painting, and their head tilted slightly, as if they were listening. I stumbled back from the window, my hands trembling. The footsteps moved again, this time toward the side of the house. I grabbed my phone and texted Mike, too afraid to make a sound. Mike came down the hall, his footsteps loud in the silence. When I told him what I'd seen, he frowned but didn't seem entirely surprised. Beth said she thought she heard someone outside last night, he admitted. I'll check it out. I followed him downstairs, my stomach churning. The house was eerily quiet, the only light coming from the faint glow of the Christmas tree. When we reached the front door, Mike grabbed a flashlight and opened it cautiously. The porch was empty, but in the snow, we saw them, footprints. They led from the edge of the yard to the front door, then around the side of the house. We followed the trail, the cold air biting at our skin. The footprints circled the house and stopped beneath the living room window. Inside, the porcelain figurine sat on the coffee table, its blank eyes reflecting the tree's lights. The next morning, we found another gift on the porch. This one was wrapped in green paper with a silver bow. Beth was reluctant to bring it inside, but curiosity won out. Inside the box was another figurine, this time of a man. Like the woman, it was beautifully detailed, but his face was twisted into an expression of sorrow, his hands clasped as if in prayer. We should get rid of these, I said, my voice shaking. Something's not right. Beth nodded, but before she could move, her youngest daughter, Sophie, spoke up. Mommy, who's the man in the yard? Our blood ran cold as we followed Sophie's gaze to the window. The figure was back, standing at the edge of the yard, motionless. This time, they were holding something, a third gift, wrapped in gold paper. Mike grabbed a bat from the hall closet and stormed outside, yelling. The figure didn't move, didn't react, until Mike was nearly upon them. Then, without warning, they turned and walked into the woods, disappearing among the trees. When Mike returned, he was holding the third gift. We didn't open it. That afternoon, we drove into town and handed the figurines over to the local police, explaining the situation. They promised to investigate, though their skeptical expressions made it clear they didn't believe us. We left the house the next day, unable to spend another night there. When we returned a week later to collect our things, the house was as we had left it, except for one detail. On the coffee table, where the figurines had been, was a new one. It was of a family, 4 figures, huddled together in fear. Their faces were eerily familiar. We didn't take it with us. And we never went back.